The first time I tried to leave the block, it was just after midnight, when the rain had slowed to a thin mist and the streetlights made the pavement shine like wet glass. I remember checking the time on my phone twice, not because I was in a hurry, but because something about the quiet felt staged, like the night was waiting for me to make a move. I had lived on that block for 3 years, long enough to know every crack in the sidewalk and every light that flickered before going out. It was a short block, barely 100 meters from my apartment building to the intersection where the road opened into the rest of the city, and I'd walked it thousands of times without thinking. That night, I stood at the entrance of my building longer than usual, listening to the rain drip from the awning, wondering why I suddenly felt like I was stepping somewhere unfamiliar. The air smelled like wet concrete and old leaves, and there was no wind, which made everything feel heavier than it should have. I told myself I was just tired, that long days can make normal places feel strange, and I started walking toward the end of the block with my hands in my pockets and my head slightly down, trying not to think too much about how empty everything looked. My footsteps sounded louder than usual, each one echoing faintly between the buildings, and I became aware of my own breathing in a way that made me uncomfortable. I glanced at the windows as I passed them, half expecting to see someone watching TV or moving around, but every apartment was dark, like the block had been abandoned without anyone telling me. About halfway down, I noticed the streetlight near the corner seemed farther away than I remembered. It wasn't dramatic, just a small thing, like the distance had stretched slightly when I wasn't looking. I slowed down without realizing it, my mind replaying the familiar image of that corner and trying to line it up with what I was seeing now. I stopped walking and stood there. Rain misting my face, staring at the end of the block. It made no sense, but I felt like if I kept going, something subtle but important would change, something I wouldn't be able to undo. After a moment, I shook my head at myself, turned around, and walked back to my building, telling myself I'd leave in the morning instead. The second time I tried was the next evening, just before sunset, when the sky was low and gray and the air felt thick with coming rain. I told myself I'd imagined everything the night before, that fear does strange things when you're alone, and I forced myself not to hesitate as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Everything looked normal at first, maybe too normal, like a memory playing back exactly as expected. The same parked cars lined the curb, the same dented mailbox leaned slightly to the left, and the same piece of tape fluttered weakly on a street sign. I focused on these details, using them to anchor myself, to prove that nothing had changed. As I walked, I became aware of how quiet it was again, no traffic sounds, no distant voices, not even a dog barking. It felt like the block existed in its own pocket of silence, separated from the rest of the city by an invisible wall, and the thought made my chest tighten in a way I didn't like. When I reached the spot where I'd stopped the night before, I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes on the corner and counted my steps in my head, the way you do when you're trying to distract yourself. 50 steps should have been enough to reach the end, but when I reached 50, the corner still looked the same distance away. I kept walking, my count climbing higher, my heartbeat slowly matching the rhythm of my steps. The buildings on either side of me didn't change, and the sidewalk beneath my feet felt solid and real, but the end of the block refused to get closer in a way that made my stomach turn. I stopped again, breathing harder now, and looked back toward my building. It was still there. Exactly where it should be, close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the sky in its windows. The normality of it made the stretched distance ahead of me feel even more wrong. I stood there for a long moment, torn between going forward and going back, until a light drizzle started and the cold seeped through my jacket. Finally, I turned around and walked back, not running, not panicking, just retreating quietly, like I'd reached the edge of something I wasn't meant to cross. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the block extending forward, the corner always just out of reach, and I woke up repeatedly with the feeling that I'd been walking in my dreams without getting anywhere. By morning, I convinced myself it was stress, that I needed fresh air and a change of routine, even though the thought of stepping outside made my hands shake slightly. The third time I tried to leave, it was late afternoon, when people should have been around. I waited until I saw someone walk past my building, an older man with a grocery bag, and I felt a brief wave of relief knowing I wouldn't be alone. I stepped outside just after him, letting the door close softly behind me. For a few seconds, everything felt normal again. The man walked ahead of me at an unhurried pace, and the sound of his shoes on the pavement grounded me. I followed at a distance, watching him as he moved steadily toward the corner. Then, without any warning, he stopped. He didn't turn around or look confused, he just stood there, staring ahead, his shoulders slightly slumped. I slowed and then stopped too, unsure why he wasn't moving. After a moment, he took a few steps forward, then stopped again, like he was walking into something invisible. I called out to him, asking if he was okay, and my voice sounded strange in the open air. Too loud and too thin at the same time. He didn't respond, didn't even react, and that was when I noticed how far away the corner still looked, despite how long we'd been walking. The man turned around slowly, his expression blank but not vacant, like he was thinking very hard about something I couldn't see. He looked past me, not at me, and then walked back toward my building without saying a word, passing me as if I wasn't there. I stood frozen, watching him disappear through the door, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. I looked back toward the corner, then down at my hands, and suddenly felt deeply, overwhelmingly tired, like the block was draining something from me just by existing. I went back inside and locked my door, sitting on the edge of my bed for a long time, listening to the muted sounds of the building settling. I told myself I wouldn't try again, that whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could fix by pushing harder, but the thought of being trapped without understanding why gnawed at me in a way I couldn't ignore. Days passed, and I avoided the sidewalk whenever I could, ordering groceries, calling in sick to work, watching the world through my window like it was a screen I was no longer part of. The block looked normal from above, cars coming and going, people passing through, but every time I imagined myself down there, my chest tightened with that familiar unease. On the fifth night, I heard footsteps outside my window long after everything else had gone quiet. They moved slowly, deliberately, back and forth along the block, and I found myself standing in the dark, watching the street below. I couldn't see anyone, just the movement of shadows and the slight change in rhythm, like someone pacing. Something in me snapped then, not in a dramatic way, but in a tired, resigned way. I put on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and went downstairs, telling myself that whatever was waiting for me, it was better than staying frozen in place. The night air was colder than I expected, and the sky was low and starless, pressing down on the buildings. I stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the familiar weight settle over me, the silence wrapping around my thoughts and muffling them. I started walking toward the end of the block again, not counting steps this time, not trying to measure distance, just moving forward because stopping felt worse. The streetlights seemed dimmer, their glow not quite reaching the ground, and the rain began again in a fine, steady sheet. As I walked, memories of the block surfaced unbidden, moments that felt both mine and not mine, like echoes of routines repeated too many times. I wondered how many times I'd already tried to leave without remembering, and the thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The corner still didn't get closer, but I kept walking, my legs heavy, my breath shallow. The buildings on either side seemed to stretch upward slightly, their windows dark and watchful, and I became acutely aware of how small I felt between them. Eventually, I slowed, not because I wanted to stop, but because my body refused to keep the same pace. The effort of moving forward felt disproportionate, like walking against a current I couldn't see, and every step took more focus than the last. I looked back once, just once, and saw my building far behind me, farther than it should have been, its shape slightly blurred by the rain. The realization that distance worked both ways settled over me like a quiet threat. I don't know how long I walked after that. Time felt stretched and thin, like it could tear if I pulled on it too hard. My thoughts looped and repeated, circling the same questions without finding answers, and the block kept going, unchanged and endless. At some point, I stopped feeling surprised by it. The fear dulled into something heavier, something closer to acceptance. And that frightened me more than the stretching distance ever had. I stood there in the rain, breathing slowly, listening to the silence press in around me. The corner was still ahead, patient and unreachable, and behind me, I could no longer see where I'd started. I stood there for a long time, unsure which direction counted as leaving anymore, with the quiet certainty that whatever this place was, it wasn't finished with me yet. She appeared beside me while I was waiting for the last train of the night, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of her coat through the thin layer of air between us. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't notice her arrive, and that was what unsettled me first, the way my mind immediately tried to rewrite the moment as if she'd been there all along. The platform was nearly empty, washed in pale fluorescent light that made everything look flatter and more distant than it should have. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof above us, steady and patient, and the electronic sign hummed quietly as it displayed another delayed arrival time. I remember thinking the night felt stretched, like it was taking longer than usual to move forward. She stood facing the tracks, her hands tucked into her pockets, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested familiarity. Not comfort exactly, but ease, like someone who knew this place well enough not to be bothered by its emptiness. I glanced at her from the corner of my eye, just long enough to register dark hair, a neutral expression, nothing remarkable enough to explain the sudden weight in my chest. I told myself I must have been distracted, that she'd walked up while I was checking my phone or watching the rain. That explanation should have settled it, but it didn't, because I couldn't shake the feeling that my awareness had been edited somehow, that a few seconds had been smoothed over without my consent. The longer we stood there, the more aware I became of the silence between us. Not awkward silence, but something thicker, like a shared pause that neither of us had initiated. The train was late, the night was quiet, and still she didn't shift her weight or glance around the way most people do when waiting. I became uncomfortably aware of my own movements, the way I adjusted my bag strap, the way I cleared my throat softly for no reason. She didn't react to any of it, and that made it feel like I was the only one truly present, like she was part of the platform itself rather than another person waiting. After a while, she spoke, her voice low and calm, as if continuing a conversation we'd already started. She said something simple about the trains always running late this time of night, and I nodded automatically before realizing I hadn't answered a question. The familiarity of her tone unsettled me more than if she'd been abrupt or strange. I replied with something equally simple, my voice sounding too loud in my own ears, and she nodded as if that was exactly what she'd expected me to say. The exchange felt rehearsed, not scripted, but remembered, like we were following steps we'd walked before. When I finally turned my head to look at her properly, she was already looking at me. Not staring, not curious, just aware, like she'd been waiting for me to catch up. Her eyes were steady, and there was something in them that made me feel like I was the one intruding. I asked her how long she'd been waiting, intending it as small talk, a way to ground myself in normal conversation. She smiled faintly and said she'd been there a while, which should have been a harmless answer, but it sat wrong with me, vague in a way that left too much room for interpretation. The train announcement crackled overhead, distorted and distant, and neither of us moved. I realized then that I didn't know which direction she was going, or even if she planned to get on the train at all. And the thought lingered longer than it should have. We fell back into silence, standing side by side as the minutes dragged on. The rain intensified, blurring the lights beyond the platform, and I felt a strange sense of narrowing, like the world had reduced itself to just this space and the two of us occupying it. I became aware of a subtle alignment between us, the way our breathing seemed to match without effort, the way we shifted slightly at the same moments. It wasn't dramatic enough to notice all at once, but persistent enough to make me uneasy once I did. At some point, she asked me if I ever felt like places remembered people. The question caught me off guard, not because it was strange, but because it echoed a thought I'd had before, one I rarely acknowledged. I hesitated too long before answering, and she nodded as if my silence was response enough. She told me she thought some places held on to routines, that they learned the shape of people who passed through them often enough. Her voice was calm, almost thoughtful, and as she spoke, I felt an uncomfortable sense of recognition, like she was describing something I'd experienced but never named. The train was delayed again, the sign updating with a soft electronic flicker, and still neither of us seemed surprised. I started to feel like the waiting itself was the point, like the night had no intention of moving forward until something else happened. I asked her where she was headed, and she answered with the name of a neighborhood I passed through often but never visited. The way she said it made it sound less like a destination and more like a habit, and I wondered how many times she'd made that same trip. She asked me the same question, and when I answered, her expression softened slightly, as if she'd been expecting it. That was when I noticed the faint sense of repetition settling in. The feeling that this exchange wasn't new, just newly noticed. When the train finally arrived, it did so quietly, gliding into the station without the usual rush of sound. The doors opened, warm light spilling out, and I felt a sudden reluctance to move, like stepping inside would break something fragile. She didn't rush either. We boarded together, choosing seats across from each other without discussing it, and the train pulled away, the station fading into darkness behind us. The carriage was nearly empty, the hum of motion steady and low. As we rode, I became aware of how natural her presence felt, how quickly my body accepted it even as my mind resisted. It was like she fit into a space beside me that I hadn't known was empty until it was filled. She spoke again, quietly, about the way nights blur together when you take the same routes often enough. I listened, my thoughts drifting, my sense of time thinning as the train moved through the dark. At some point, I realized I couldn't remember when I'd stopped feeling surprised by her being there. The question of how she'd appeared beside me seemed distant now, unimportant, replaced by the heavier question of whether I'd ever noticed when she wasn't. When the train slowed near my stop, I felt a subtle tension rise, like the moment before waking from a dream. I stood, and she stood too, though she hadn't said this was her stop. We exited together, stepping onto another quiet platform washed in artificial light. As the train pulled away, I turned to ask her something, but the words caught in my throat. She was already walking, unhurried, down the stairs toward the exit, as if she knew the way perfectly. I followed without deciding to, my steps echoing softly behind hers. Outside, the rain had eased, the street nearly empty, and the night air felt thick and familiar. She walked beside me then, close enough that I could feel her presence without looking, and the thought returned, heavier than before. Not that she'd appeared suddenly, but that she hadn't arrived at all, that she'd simply been there, waiting for me to notice, and the idea settled into me with a quiet, lingering discomfort that refused to fade. The crosswalk light flickered without changing the first time I noticed it, and I remember thinking it was just another small malfunction in a city full of them. It was late, a little after 1:30 a.m., and the rain had left the street slick and reflective, turning every streetlight into a long smear of yellow on the asphalt. I stood at the corner, hands deep in my jacket pockets, waiting for the white walking figure to appear like it always did. The red hand glowed steadily, then dimmed for a second, then brightened again, never switching, never counting down. Cars passed occasionally, their tires hissing softly over the wet road, and the sound faded quickly into the distance, leaving the intersection strangely hollow. I checked my phone, not because I needed the time, but because looking down made me feel less exposed. I waited longer than I meant to. The light flickered again, a subtle pulse, like it was struggling to stay awake. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other and glanced up and down the street, expecting to see someone else waiting, someone to confirm that this delay was real and not just my impatience stretching the moment. No one else was there. The buildings around me were dark, their windows reflecting the street rather than revealing anything inside. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like wet rails or old wiring. I felt an urge to step back from the curb, though nothing had happened yet. The red hand flickered again. Still no change. I told myself it was broken. Crosswalk lights broke all the time. Usually they defaulted to one state until someone fixed them, and the reasonable thing to do was wait for a clear gap in traffic and cross anyway. Still, I stayed where I was. My eyes fixed on the signal, waiting for it to do what it was supposed to. After a while, I noticed something else. The traffic lights for the cars were cycling normally. Green, yellow, red, then back again, smooth and predictable. Each time the cars stopped, I expected the crosswalk to change with them, but it never did. The red hand remained, flickering faintly, like a reflection rather than a command. Minutes passed. I stopped checking my phone because the time no longer felt helpful. The night felt stretched, thin and quiet, as if the intersection existed slightly out of sync with the rest of the city. I could hear my own breathing, slow and shallow, and the soft buzz of electricity coming from the signal box beside me. I pressed the crosswalk button again, even though I'd already pressed it several times. It made the same dull click, the same unconvincing sound of something pretending to work. The light flickered in response, but didn't change, and a small wave of irritation washed over me, followed by something colder and harder to explain. I looked across the street, measuring the distance. It wasn't a wide road, just 2 lanes in each direction, familiar enough that I could have crossed it with my eyes closed. The sidewalk on the other side looked exactly the same as the one I stood on, empty and damp, stretching away under evenly spaced streetlights. For a moment, I imagined stepping off the curb anyway. The street was empty then, no headlights in sight, and the quiet felt permissive, almost encouraging. My foot shifted forward slightly, and then I stopped myself, a sudden thought anchoring me in place. What if the light wasn't broken, I wondered, but waiting for something else? The idea felt stupid as soon as it formed, and yet I couldn't shake it. I stepped back from the curb, heart beating a little faster, and forced myself to laugh quietly at my own imagination. Lack of sleep. That's all, combined with an empty street and too much time to think. The red hand flickered again. I became aware then of how long I'd been standing there. My legs felt stiff, my shoulders tense, like my body had been holding a posture it wasn't meant to keep for this long. The intersection looked unchanged, frozen in a repeating loop of traffic lights and empty lanes, and I felt oddly disconnected from it, like a viewer rather than a participant. A car finally approached from my left, slowing as it reached the red light. It stopped completely, engine idling softly, and the driver stared straight ahead, hands on the wheel. This was it, I thought. This was the moment the crosswalk would change. It didn't. The driver didn't look at me. The light for the cars turned green again, and the car drove on, leaving me alone at the corner once more. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing in around my ears. I tried to remember if I'd ever seen this light change before. I was sure I had. I walked this route often enough, late at night, early in the morning, in all kinds of weather. The memory of the white walking figure felt real, but distant, like recalling a place you haven't visited in years. The flickering grew slightly more frequent, not brighter, just more insistent, like a nervous habit. I found myself watching it closely, tracking the rhythm of the dimming and brightening, and that was when I noticed it wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, subtle but deliberate, repeating every few seconds. I looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with how focused I'd become. The street beyond the intersection seemed longer than it should have been, stretching into darkness without any visible end. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty sidewalks behind me, half expecting to see someone watching, someone else caught in the same pause. Still no one. The idea of leaving the intersection without crossing occurred to me then. I could turn around, take a longer route home, avoid this corner entirely. The thought brought a brief sense of relief, followed immediately by hesitation. I didn't like the idea of the light continuing to flicker behind me, doing whatever it was doing without my attention. I stayed. Time lost its shape after that. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the light refuse to change. My thoughts looped and blurred, circling the same questions without settling on answers. The rain began again at some point, light at first, then steadier, tapping softly against the signal pole beside me. Eventually, I noticed something else that made my skin prickle. The sound of the city felt muted, distant, as if someone had turned the volume down. Even when cars passed, their noise faded too quickly, swallowed by the night before it could fully register. The crosswalk light flickered again, and this time, for just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something else layered beneath the red hand. Not a clear image, not enough to describe, just the impression of movement where there shouldn't have been any. I blinked hard and leaned closer, rain spotting my eyelashes. The light returned to its usual steady red, flickering softly, patiently. My heart beat harder, and I became aware of how alone I was in a way that went beyond simple emptiness. I pressed the button one last time. The click echoed faintly, swallowed by the quiet, and nothing changed. I don't remember deciding to cross. I just remember finding myself in the street, the wet pavement cold beneath my shoes, my senses sharpened to an uncomfortable degree. Every step felt deliberate, heavy, like I was moving through resistance rather than air. Halfway across, I glanced back at the signal. The red hand was still there, flickering gently, unchanged, watching me from the corner like it had never expected me to obey it in the first place. I reached the other side without incident, stepping onto the empty sidewalk with a strange sense of displacement, like I'd arrived somewhere slightly wrong. The street behind me looked normal, the intersection quiet and unremarkable, and yet I didn't feel like anything had resolved. I walked away quickly, not running, but not slow either, resisting the urge to look back again. Even as the intersection disappeared behind me, I could still picture the light flickering, endlessly repeating a signal that no longer felt meant for me. Sometimes now, when I wait at crosswalks late at night, I catch myself watching the lights too closely, counting the seconds, searching for patterns. And every so often, when the red hand lingers a moment longer than it should, I feel that same quiet hesitation return, as if the light is still deciding whether it wants to let me go. I heard music coming from a building with no windows on a night when the city felt unusually hollow, like sound itself was hesitant to travel. It was just after midnight, the kind of hour where even familiar streets feel slightly rearranged, and I was walking home under a low sky that smelled faintly of rain and dust. The building sat halfway down a side street I usually avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt unfinished, like it had been forgotten before anyone decided what it was supposed to be. It was a tall concrete structure with blank walls on every side, no signage, no glass, no visible entrances from the street, and yet it had always been there, quietly occupying space without explanation. I noticed the music before I noticed the building itself, a soft melody drifting through the air, thin but steady, like it had nowhere else to go. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't echoing the way sound usually does between buildings, which made it feel oddly close, as if it was being played just for whoever happened to be nearby. I stopped walking without realizing it, my steps fading into the damp pavement, and listened. The music didn't have words, just a slow, looping tune that felt familiar in a way I couldn't place, like something I'd heard long ago but never learned the name of. The longer I listened, the more aware I became of how quiet everything else was. There were no cars passing, no distant sirens, no voices drifting from open windows, only the music and the faint hum of the city settling into itself. I felt exposed standing there, like I was interrupting something private, and I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed it. The street was empty. The buildings across from me were dark, their windows reflecting nothing but my own stillness, and the music continued, patient and unbothered by the lack of an audience. I told myself it must be coming from somewhere else, maybe a basement club or a car parked out of sight, and my brain worked quickly to give the sound a reasonable origin. Still, my eyes kept returning to the windowless building. Up close, it was even more unsettling, its concrete surface smooth and uninterrupted, like a wall built to keep everything out rather than let anything in. There were no vents, no cracks large enough to suggest hidden speakers, nothing that explained how sound could escape from inside, assuming there was even an inside to speak of. The music shifted slightly then, the melody dipping into a lower register, and I felt a small tightening in my chest, an emotional response that didn't feel entirely mine. It wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition, as if some part of me had been waiting to hear this sound again. I took a step closer, then stopped, suddenly aware of how deliberate the movement felt. The music didn't get louder, didn't change direction, it simply continued at the same volume, as though distance didn't matter to it. That detail unsettled me more than if it had reacted naturally. I stood there for a long moment, listening, my thoughts slowing to match the pace of the tune. The night air felt thicker around the building, cooler somehow, and I noticed that my breath fogged slightly even though the temperature hadn't dropped elsewhere on the street. I tried to recall when I'd first noticed this building, how long it had been part of my route, but the memory slipped away from me, vague and uncooperative. It felt like trying to remember a dream after waking, the details dissolving the harder I focused on them. The music continued, looping seamlessly, and I became aware of how tired I felt all of a sudden, like I'd been walking much longer than I actually had. My feet ached faintly, my shoulders sagged, and the idea of standing there indefinitely didn't seem as strange as it should have. A light drizzle began to fall, barely more than a mist, and the street took on a muted sheen. The music remained unchanged, unaffected by the weather, and I noticed that it didn't echo or distort the way sound usually does in rain, which made it feel insulated from the world around it. I reached out and placed my hand against the wall, half expecting to feel vibration beneath the concrete. The surface was cold and dry, solid and unyielding, and yet the music persisted, as if my hand had passed right through it without touching anything at all. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart beating a little faster, and laughed under my breath at the absurdity of the situation. Buildings don't play music, I told myself, and even if they did, there was nothing threatening about a quiet melody on an empty street. The laughter died quickly, swallowed by the silence between notes. I became aware then of how long I'd been standing there. My phone screen glowed faintly in my pocket as a notification buzzed, startling me enough to make my heart jump. When I checked the time, more than 30 minutes had passed since I'd stopped walking, though it felt like no more than 5. The realization sent a ripple of unease through me. I looked up and down the street again, half expecting something to have changed while I wasn't paying attention. Everything looked the same, too much the same, like a still image rather than a living place. The music shifted again, this time introducing a subtle variation, a note that lingered slightly longer than before. The change felt intentional, almost responsive, and I felt a sudden, irrational certainty that it was aware of me listening. I took a step back, then another, testing whether distance would break whatever hold the sound had on me. It didn't. The music followed, or perhaps stayed exactly where it was while I moved, maintaining the same quiet presence in my ears. My instincts told me to leave, to walk away and not look back, but another part of me hesitated, reluctant in a way that felt borrowed. The thought of the music continuing without me there filled me with an unexpected sense of loss. I wondered then if anyone else had ever stopped here, if others had heard it and stood where I was standing, listening until time blurred. The building gave no clues, its blank surface offering nothing back, and the idea that it had witnessed countless unnoticed moments settled uncomfortably in my mind. The drizzle turned into steady rain, and the streetlights flickered slightly, their reflections shivering across the pavement. The music didn't falter. If anything, it felt clearer, more present, like it preferred the rain. I closed my eyes briefly, just to see if the sound would disappear when I wasn't looking at the building. It didn't. With my eyes shut, it felt closer, inside my head rather than out on the street, and I opened them quickly, unsettled by how easily my sense of space had shifted. That was when I noticed the absence of something else. My own footsteps, my breathing, even the sound of rain hitting my jacket felt muted, like the music was quietly pushing everything else into the background. I took another step back, then turned and began walking away, forcing my legs into motion before I could second-guess myself. The music didn't stop, but it didn't follow either. It remained behind me, steady and patient, as though it knew exactly how far it could reach. I didn't look back, though the urge gnawed at me with every step. The street ahead felt longer than usual, stretching out under the dim lights, and the sense of being watched lingered even as the sound slowly faded into something barely perceptible. When I reached the corner and turned onto my usual route home, the music was gone entirely. The sudden absence felt louder than the sound itself had been, leaving the night feeling thin and exposed. I walked the rest of the way quickly, my thoughts looping around the building, the melody, the lost time. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had soaked through my jacket, and my hands were shaking slightly as I unlocked the door. Inside, the silence pressed in, heavy and complete. I stood in the dark for a moment, listening for any trace of the music, any echo that might have followed me home. There was nothing. But later that night, lying in bed with the city murmuring faintly beyond my walls, I found myself humming a tune I didn't remember learning, my voice low and unsure, and the realization that I knew exactly how the melody went settled over me with a quiet, creeping unease that refused to let me sleep. She smiled gently, like this was normal, like nothing about the moment required explanation, and that was what unsettled me most. It happened on a quiet evening when the sky was already darkening too early, the kind of dusk where streetlights come on before you're ready for the day to end. I was sitting on a bench near the bus stop, the metal still cold from the day, scrolling aimlessly on my phone while waiting for a route that was already 10 minutes late. The street was calm. Almost empty, with only the distant sound of traffic moving somewhere beyond the nearby buildings. The air smelled faintly of rain, though none had fallen yet, and everything felt suspended, like the city was holding its breath. She was already sitting beside me when I looked up. I don't remember hearing her arrive. One moment, the bench was empty except for me, and the next, she was there, close enough that our coats brushed slightly when I shifted. My first thought was that I'd simply been distracted, that she'd sat down while I was looking at my phone, and my brain hurried to smooth over the gap. She looked ahead, not at me, her posture relaxed, hands folded loosely in her lap. There was nothing unusual about her appearance that I could point to, no obvious detail that set off alarm bells. She wore a simple coat, dark hair pulled back loosely, her face calm in a way that felt practiced. I glanced at her again, just to confirm she was really there. That was when she turned her head and smiled. It wasn't a wide smile or an exaggerated one. It was small, gentle, polite, the kind of smile people give when they acknowledge a stranger without inviting conversation. But there was something about it that made my stomach tighten, a quiet confidence that suggested she knew more about the situation than I did. For a moment, I smiled back automatically. The reflex surprised me, and I felt foolish immediately after, like I'd responded to a cue I didn't remember being given. She turned her gaze forward again, as if the interaction had gone exactly as expected. The bus stop remained quiet. No bus approached, no footsteps echoed nearby, and the digital sign above us flickered briefly before returning to its usual delayed message. I told myself to relax, to stop overthinking a simple encounter, but my attention kept drifting back to her presence beside me. She sat very still. Not rigid, not tense, just still, like someone who had no reason to fidget or check the time. I became uncomfortably aware of my own movements, the way I crossed and uncrossed my ankles, the way I adjusted my grip on my phone. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft and even, as if continuing a conversation that had paused briefly. She commented on how buses never seemed to run on time anymore, her tone casual, almost amused. The words themselves were ordinary, but the familiarity of the way she said them caught me off guard. I nodded and replied without thinking, agreeing with her, adding a small complaint of my own. As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a flicker of unease. I didn't remember deciding to engage, and yet the exchange flowed too smoothly to feel spontaneous. She listened, her expression attentive, then smiled again, the same gentle smile, like this was all perfectly routine. The smile lingered a second longer than felt necessary, and I found myself searching her face for some sign of irony or curiosity. There was none. The streetlights hummed softly as they fully warmed, casting a yellow glow over the pavement. I noticed then how quiet the area had become. Even the distant traffic sounded muted, as if the world beyond the bus stop had drifted slightly farther away. I checked the time on my phone, then checked it again a few seconds later, unsettled by how long it felt like I'd been sitting there. Only a minute had passed. The realization didn't comfort me. She followed my gaze to the phone and tilted her head slightly, still smiling. "It does that sometimes," she said, though I hadn't mentioned anything aloud. Her tone suggested she was offering reassurance. I frowned, unsure what she meant, and asked what did what. She paused, just briefly, as if recalibrating, then said time could feel strange when you were waiting. The explanation was reasonable enough, but the way she said it made me feel like I'd failed a small test. We fell into silence again. The bench felt harder beneath me, the air cooler against my face. I noticed that the sky seemed darker than it should have been for the hour, the clouds pressing low and heavy above the street. I became aware then of a subtle sense of repetition. Not déjà vu exactly, but the impression that the moment was slightly worn, like a scene that had been played before and smoothed down by use. The thought made my pulse quicken. I asked her if she lived nearby, intending it as harmless small talk. She turned to look at me fully this time, her eyes steady and unreadable, and said she spent a lot of time around here. The answer felt deliberately incomplete. Before I could follow up, she added that people tended to pass through this stop more than they realized. The comment landed oddly, not quite fitting into the conversation, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked down the road, expecting to see headlights approaching at last. The street stretched out empty, the asphalt gleaming faintly under the lights. The bus schedule sign flickered again, resetting the delay without explanation. I shifted on the bench, suddenly eager to stand, to create a bit of distance between us. As I did, she adjusted too, subtly, maintaining the same space between us without seeming to move at all. The precision of it made my breath catch. She smiled again, softer this time, almost sympathetic. "You don't have to rush," she said quietly. "It usually works itself out." The words settled over me like a weight. I asked what she meant, my voice lower than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the empty street, her expression peaceful, as if she were enjoying a familiar view. For a moment, I wondered if anyone else could see us sitting there, two figures on a bench in an otherwise empty space. The thought of passers-by glancing over, seeing nothing unusual, made me feel strangely isolated. I stood up then, the decision sudden and unplanned. The metal bench creaked softly as I moved. She didn't react, didn't look surprised or offended. She simply looked up at me, that gentle smile still in place, like this was the natural next step. As I stepped away, my legs felt heavy, like I was walking through shallow water. I took a few steps, then glanced back without meaning to. She was still sitting there, hands folded, posture relaxed, watching me with quiet patience. The smile hadn't faded. If anything, it seemed steadier now, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I hesitated, a question rising to my lips that I couldn't quite form. She tilted her head slightly, encouraging without speaking, and for a brief, disorienting second, I felt the urge to sit back down, to resume my place beside her as if I'd never stood up at all. I forced myself to turn away and walk down the street, not toward my destination, but simply away from the bus stop. With each step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, or her voice calling out calmly, but there was nothing. When I finally stopped and looked back, the bus stop was empty. The bench sat under the streetlight, unoccupied, ordinary, as if no one had been there at all. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to decide whether I felt relieved or unsettled. The smile lingered in my mind, gentle and assured, like an answer to a question I hadn't asked. Even now, when I sit beside strangers in quiet places, when someone smiles at me without a hint of confusion or curiosity, I feel that same flicker of unease. Like somewhere, somehow, I've already been here before, and she's already smiling, waiting for me to notice that this is just how things are supposed to be. The road curved, though it looked straight, and I didn't notice it at first because there was no reason to. It was just after 2 a.m. The kind of hour where even familiar routes feel slightly detached from the rest of the day, and I was walking home under a sky that hadn't decided whether it wanted to rain or not. I had taken that road hundreds of times. It was a long, narrow stretch connecting two larger streets, lined with low buildings and evenly spaced lamps that cast pale pools of light onto the asphalt. At night, it was quiet but never unsettling, just empty enough to let your thoughts wander without resistance. That night felt different in a way I couldn't immediately explain. The air was heavy, pressing gently against my chest, and my footsteps sounded softer than usual, as if the road was absorbing the sound instead of reflecting it back. I remember thinking the silence felt intentional, like it was being maintained rather than simply happening. I kept my eyes forward, following the line of streetlights as they receded into the distance. From where I stood, the road looked perfectly straight, a clean line stretching ahead until it disappeared into darkness. There were no bends, no intersections, nothing to complicate the path. I walked for a while without thinking about it, my mind drifting the way it does when you're tired but not ready to sleep. I checked my phone once, more out of habit than necessity, and noted the time before slipping it back into my pocket. When I looked up again, something felt subtly off. The streetlights ahead seemed to be arranged differently, not dramatically, just enough that my sense of distance wavered. I told myself it was fatigue, that staring at the same repeating shapes for too long can make them blur together, and I kept walking. A few minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt loose, stretched thin like it was being pulled from both ends. The buildings on either side of the road remained consistent, their facades dark and unremarkable, but I noticed that I hadn't passed any new landmarks in a while. I slowed slightly, scanning my surroundings. The same closed storefront, the same narrow alley, the same faint graffiti near a lamppost. I was sure I'd already walked past them, but there they were again, unchanged. The thought made my stomach tighten. I stopped walking and stood there, listening. The night offered nothing back. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of the city. Just the soft buzz of the streetlight above me and the faint sound of my own breathing. I turned slowly in a full circle, trying to orient myself. Behind me, the road looked the same as it had ahead of me, straight and empty, stretching away under identical lights. There was no obvious curve, no visible deviation, and yet the sense of displacement lingered. I laughed quietly under my breath, the sound thin and unconvincing. Getting turned around on a straight road was ridiculous. I checked my phone again, confirming my location on the map. The blue dot sat exactly where it should have been, aligned neatly with the road. Satisfied, or at least reassured enough to continue, I started walking again. The further I went, the more aware I became of a gentle pull, not physical exactly, but directional, like the road was guiding me without my consent. My steps felt slightly angled, though when I looked down, my feet were aligned straight ahead. I tried walking closer to one side of the road, then the other, testing the sensation. No matter where I stepped, the subtle pull remained, nudging my path in a way I couldn't quite measure. I focused on the streetlights again, using them as reference points. One by one, I passed beneath them, counting in my head to stay grounded. 10 lights. 15. 20. The end of the road should have appeared by then. Instead, the lights continued, evenly spaced, receding into the same dark distance as before. The realization settled over me slowly, like cold water soaking into fabric. I stopped again, heart beating a little faster now. The road still looked straight. Perfectly straight. But my body knew something my eyes refused to acknowledge. I thought about turning back, about retracing my steps and finding the intersection I knew was there. The idea brought a brief sense of relief, quickly followed by hesitation. I didn't like the thought of discovering what the road looked like from the other direction. Still, standing there felt worse. I turned around. For a moment, everything looked normal. The light stretched away behind me, the building stood in familiar silence, and the night air felt unchanged. I took a few steps, then a few more, watching carefully for any sign of progress. The same storefront appeared again, its metal shutter marked with the same scratches I remembered. The same alley yawned beside it, dark and narrow. My breath caught as recognition set in. I hadn't gone far enough to be back here. A quiet panic stirred in my chest, restrained but insistent. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, that the road must curve gently without being obvious, looping back on itself in a way I'd never noticed before. I looked down at the asphalt, searching for a visible bend, a change in angle, anything to confirm the theory. The road remained stubbornly straight beneath my feet. The streetlight above me flickered briefly, dimming for a fraction of a second before returning to full brightness. The sound of its hum changed subtly, dropping in pitch, and I felt a sudden urge to keep moving. I walked again, choosing a direction without thinking too hard about it. The pull returned, familiar now, guiding me along a path that didn't feel entirely my own. My thoughts began to loop, circling the same questions without settling on answers. How long had I been walking? How far had I gone? Why did everything look the same? I checked my phone again. The time hadn't changed. The screen glowed softly in the dark, and for a moment, I felt disconnected from it, like it belonged to someone else. I locked it quickly, unsettled by how little comfort it offered. The road began to feel narrower, though the buildings hadn't moved. The space between them felt compressed, like the air itself was leaning inward. I became acutely aware of my shoulders, of how I held them slightly hunched as if bracing against something unseen. The silence deepened. Even the faint buzz of the streetlights seemed muted now, as though the sound was being absorbed before it could fully reach me. I had the irrational thought that the road was listening. I slowed, then stopped, afraid that continuing would make things worse but equally afraid of what might happen if I stayed still. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears, the only clear sound left. I tried something then, more out of desperation than logic. I stepped off the road and onto the sidewalk, breaking the straight line I'd been following. The pull resisted briefly, then eased, like a tension being released. For a moment, I felt relief. Then I noticed that the sidewalk curved gently, guiding me back toward the center of the road without any visible incline. The motion was so subtle I might not have noticed if I hadn't been watching for it. I stepped back onto the asphalt, heart sinking. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and unwelcome. The road didn't need to look curved. It didn't need to show me anything at all. It simply guided movement the way water does, shaping paths without ever announcing itself. I wondered then how many times I'd walked this way without noticing, how many nights had passed where I'd followed the curve without question. The thought made my skin prickle. I tried to picture the city map in my head, the way this road connected to others, the angles and intersections I knew so well. The mental image felt flat and unconvincing, like a diagram of a place that no longer existed. The streetlight ahead flickered again, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming fatigue. The idea of continuing didn't seem threatening anymore, just inevitable, like resisting gravity. I took another step, then another, moving with the curve I couldn't see but could feel. The road accepted me without comment, smooth and unbroken beneath my feet. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I saw the outline of an intersection, a break in the endless line of lights. The sight filled me with cautious hope, though I didn't trust it enough to let myself feel relieved. As I walked toward it, the shape didn't grow any closer. It remained fixed, hovering at the edge of visibility, patient and unmoving. I slowed, then stopped, standing alone on a road that refused to admit its own shape. The buildings watched in silence, the lights hummed softly, and the night pressed in from all sides. I don't remember how long I stood there, weighing the idea of turning back against the pull urging me forward. Eventually, the distinction began to blur. The road remained straight to my eyes, gently curved to everything else, and as I took another step, I had the quiet, unsettling sense that wherever it was leading, I had already been following it for a long time. I passed the same tree 3 times without turning, and the first time it happened, I didn't even register it as strange. It was late, close to 11:45 p.m., and I was walking home after taking a longer route than usual just to clear my head. The air was cool but not cold, heavy with the smell of damp soil and old leaves, and the sky hung low and clouded, trapping the streetlight glow close to the ground. The street was one I knew well enough to walk without thinking. A straight residential road, narrow sidewalks, parked cars pressed close to the curb, and a row of identical apartment buildings on one side. On the other side was a short line of old trees planted decades ago, each one spaced evenly apart, their trunks thick and dark, their branches reaching over the road like tired arms. I remember the tree because it leaned slightly toward the street, its bark split in a long pale scar that caught the light. I'd noticed it before on other nights, usually without stopping, usually without thought. That night, I passed it, glanced at it, and kept walking. Nothing felt wrong yet. My footsteps were steady, the sound muted by the damp pavement. Somewhere far away, a car passed, but the noise faded quickly, leaving the street empty again. I checked my phone briefly, more out of habit than necessity, then slipped it back into my pocket and kept going. A minute or two later, I saw the tree again. At first, my brain refused to acknowledge it as the same one. Streets repeat themselves, trees look alike, and at night everything blurs together. I assumed I'd mistaken it for another, maybe one with similar damage, similar posture. I walked past it again, the pale scar catching the streetlight in the same way. A faint unease settled in my chest, light enough to ignore. I slowed slightly, scanning the buildings across the street, looking for confirmation that I was still moving forward. The same balconies, the same dark windows, the same flickering light near the entrance of one building. Everything matched what I remembered. I told myself the street must curve gently without me realizing it, looping just enough to bring me past similar scenery. The explanation felt thin, but it was better than the alternative, and I accepted it without pushing further. I kept walking. The silence deepened as I went. Even the faint hum of electricity from the streetlight seemed distant, as though it was happening somewhere else. I became aware of my breathing, slow and controlled, and the slight tension in my shoulders that I hadn't noticed before. Then I saw the tree again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The same lean. The same pale scar running down the trunk. The same small pile of fallen leaves gathered at its base, pressed against the curb as if they'd been swept there intentionally. I stopped walking without meaning to, my feet refusing to take another step. I stood there, staring at it, waiting for something to change. Nothing did. The street behind me stretched away under evenly spaced lights. Ahead of me, the road continued in a straight line, disappearing into darkness. There were no intersections, no visible turns, no reason I should be here again. My heartbeat picked up, loud in my ears. I looked down at my shoes, then back up at the tree, as if the act of looking away might reset something. The night air felt thicker now, harder to draw into my lungs. I laughed quietly, the sound brittle and short. "You're tired," I muttered to myself, though hearing my own voice out loud made the street feel even emptier. I pulled out my phone and checked the map. The blue dot showed me exactly where I expected to be, halfway down the street, moving steadily toward home. The line ahead was straight, uninterrupted. No loops. No curves. I locked the screen quickly, unsettled by how little comfort it gave me. I stepped forward again, deliberately this time, counting my steps in my head. 1, 2, 3. I forced myself not to look at the tree as I passed it, fixing my gaze instead on the next streetlight ahead. The light didn't seem to get any closer. The sensation of walking began to feel strange, like my body was moving but the world wasn't responding in the right way. My legs grew heavy, not with exhaustion, but with resistance, as if the air itself had thickened around my knees. I glanced to my left, then my right, searching for anything new. A different car. An open window. A sign I hadn't seen before. Everything remained stubbornly familiar, worn into place like a set piece. After what felt like several minutes, I slowed again, dread pooling quietly in my stomach. The tree stood ahead of me once more. I didn't stop this time. I kept walking, my pace uneven, my breath shallow. As I drew closer, I noticed details I hadn't before. A strip of old tape wrapped loosely around one branch. A small notch carved into the bark near the scar, shallow and uneven, like someone had started to carve something and given up. I passed it for the third time without turning, without stopping, without changing direction. The realization settled over me slowly, like a heavy blanket. I was not looping back. The street itself was repeating. I stopped again, this time placing a hand against the tree's trunk. The bark was cold and rough beneath my palm, solid and undeniably real. I half expected my hand to pass through it, or for the texture to feel wrong, but it didn't. If anything, the solidity made everything worse. I stepped back and looked down the street again. The lights hummed softly, identical, evenly spaced, stretching on longer than they should have. The buildings stood silent, their dark windows offering no reflection of movement. I became aware then of how quiet it truly was. No wind. No distant traffic. No rustle of leaves. Even my own breathing seemed muted, as if the sound couldn't fully form. I tried to retrace my steps, turning around carefully, watching the ground as I moved. After a short distance, my heart sank. The tree was behind me again. The same one. Same scar. Same leaves. Panic rose, sharp but controlled. Like something I'd learned to keep contained. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, some subtle curve, some optical illusion amplified by darkness and fatigue. I told myself not to run. Still, my steps quickened. The faster I walked, the more the street seemed to resist me. The distance between the lights felt unchanged no matter how far I went. My muscles burned faintly, though I hadn't been walking that long. The tree appeared again, patient and unmoved. This time, I didn't approach it. I stopped several feet away, my chest tight, my thoughts spiraling. The street felt narrower now, the buildings closer, leaning inward just enough to make the space feel compressed. A terrible thought occurred to me then, quiet and insistent. What if I wasn't passing the tree? What if the tree was passing me? The idea clung to my mind, reshaping everything I'd experienced. The identical distances. The unchanging scenery. The sense of resistance. I imagined the street moving subtly beneath my feet, carrying me past the same fixed point again and again while convincing me I was the one walking. My stomach churned. I took a step backward, then another, watching the tree closely. It didn't move. The street didn't ripple or shift. Everything remained perfectly still. And yet, when I looked up again, I was closer to it than before. I turned sharply toward the buildings, searching for an entrance, any door I could try. The nearest one loomed dark and unwelcoming, its glass reflecting the streetlights but nothing else. I knocked once, then again, the sound dull and final. No response. The tree stood just within my peripheral vision, its presence pressing against my awareness even when I wasn't looking at it directly. I felt an overwhelming urge not to lose sight of it, as if turning my back on it would allow something worse to happen. Time began to feel unreliable. I checked my phone again. The clock read the same minute it had earlier. No missed notifications. No sign that time had passed at all. My hands trembled slightly as I put the phone away. Eventually, I did the only thing I hadn't tried yet. I sat down on the curb beside the tree. The concrete was cold and damp, seeping through my clothes. From this low angle, the street looked different, the light stretching overhead like a tunnel. The repetition felt less aggressive here, more resigned, like the street was waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my fear to dull into something quieter, heavier. Long enough for the idea of standing up and walking again to feel pointless. At some point, the streetlight above me flickered. Just once. When I looked up again, the tree was gone. In its place was another stretch of road, empty and straight, leading toward an intersection I recognized immediately. My heart lurched as relief washed through me, sudden and disorienting. I stood up slowly, afraid to move too quickly, afraid to break whatever fragile change had occurred. I walked toward the intersection, not looking back, each step careful and deliberate. I made it home without seeing the tree again. But sometimes, late at night, when I walk familiar streets and pass familiar landmarks, I catch myself slowing down, counting under my breath. And every time I see a tree leaning just a little too close to the road, with bark marked by a pale scar, I feel the urge to stop and sit beside it, as if part of me is still waiting there, convinced that if I keep walking, I'll only pass it again. She stopped walking, but I could still hear her steps, and at first I convinced myself it was just an echo playing tricks on me. It was close to midnight, the kind of hour when the city feels emptied out but not asleep, and the street was damp from an earlier rain that left everything smelling faintly of asphalt and wet stone. We had been walking side by side for several minutes without really talking. I didn't remember when she joined me. Only that at some point she was there, keeping pace as naturally as if we'd planned it. Our footsteps had fallen into a quiet rhythm, soft and even, blending together until it was hard to tell which sound belonged to which of us. The street was narrow and dim, lined with old buildings whose windows reflected the streetlights but revealed nothing inside. The lamps cast long shadows that stretched and overlapped across the sidewalk, and every so often, water dripped from a gutter somewhere above us, breaking the silence and then leaving it heavier than before. I noticed she stopped because the space beside me felt suddenly lighter, like something had been removed without making a sound. My shoulder brushed only empty air, and instinctively, I slowed and turned my head. She was standing still. She hadn't stumbled or hesitated. She had simply stopped, feet planted on the wet pavement, her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Her expression was calm, almost thoughtful, like she'd paused to consider something unimportant. But the sound of footsteps continued. They were close, right beside me, matching the pace I'd been walking a moment earlier. One step, then another, soft and measured, the same sound I'd been hearing all along. My body reacted before my mind did, a jolt of cold running through my chest as I took another step forward. The footsteps stayed with me. I stopped abruptly, my breath catching in my throat. The sound took one more step after I did, then another, before slowing to a stop as well. The silence that followed felt sharp, like something had been cut too cleanly. I turned fully toward her. She hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she had been, hands loose at her sides, her face unreadable in the yellow light of the street lamp above us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. She looked at me then, slowly, as if she'd been waiting for me to speak. Her eyes were steady, untroubled, and when she smiled, it was small and reassuring, like I'd asked something obvious. "Hear what?" she said. Before I could answer, the sound returned. One step. Then another. It wasn't loud. It didn't rush. It simply continued, measured and patient, moving forward along the sidewalk ahead of us. I felt my pulse pick up, each beat heavy in my ears, and I glanced past her shoulder to see where the sound was coming from. The sidewalk ahead was empty. No one walked there. No shadows moved except our own, stretched thin by the streetlights. And yet the footsteps kept going, retreating slowly into the distance as if someone invisible were continuing the walk she'd abandoned. I swallowed hard and laughed quietly, the sound brittle and false. "Probably just water dripping," I said, though I knew the rhythm was wrong for that. Too deliberate. Too even. She didn't argue. She just watched me, her expression softening slightly, like she was humoring a nervous habit. "This street carries sound strangely," she said. "It always has." The way she said always made my stomach tighten. The footsteps faded, dissolving into the general quiet of the night, and I stood there trying to convince myself I'd imagined them. The rain-slick pavement glistened beneath the lights, and for a moment, everything looked ordinary again. "Are you coming?" I asked, nodding down the street. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then nodded and stepped forward. Her shoes made contact with the pavement, the sound familiar and grounding, and I felt a small wave of relief wash through me. We walked on. For a while, everything seemed fine. Our footsteps fell back into rhythm, the night remained quiet, and the street stretched ahead of us without incident. I told myself the moment had passed, that my nerves had settled. Then I noticed something subtle. Her steps were slightly out of sync with mine now. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to make the rhythm feel wrong. I slowed, and she slowed too, but the sound didn't quite line up the way it should have. I glanced down at our feet. They were moving together, exactly as they should have been. Still, the sound lagged. I focused on it, my chest tightening as I listened closely. There were moments when I could swear I heard an extra step, faint but distinct, falling between ours. The idea made my skin prickle. "Do you ever feel like places remember you?" she asked suddenly, her voice calm and unhurried. The question felt misplaced, but familiar in a way I didn't like. "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged slightly. "Like the ground knows the shape of your walk. Like it keeps going even when you stop." As she spoke, she slowed to a halt again. I stopped too, heart pounding now, every nerve in my body alert. She stood beside me, motionless, her face turned slightly upward toward the darkened buildings. The footsteps did not stop. They continued past us this time, moving ahead down the sidewalk with quiet confidence. One step. 2. 3. Each sound clear and unmistakable, receding slowly as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I couldn't move. My legs felt locked in place, my breath shallow and tight in my chest. The sound carried on until it blended with the distant hum of the city, leaving behind a silence that felt too intentional. I turned to her, my voice barely steady. "That's not normal." She smiled gently, the same calm expression as before, like this was an observation she'd been expecting. "It happens," she said. "Sometimes you keep going longer than you think." I didn't ask what she meant. I was afraid of the answer. The street felt narrower now, the buildings leaning in just enough to make the space feel compressed. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, their glow struggling to reach the ground. I took a step backward. She didn't follow. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, quietly, I heard footsteps again, this time behind me. Slow. Careful. Matching the pace I'd taken a moment earlier. I didn't turn around. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I took another step back, then another, and the sound followed, perfectly aligned with my movement, as if someone were retracing my steps a half-second late. "Don't rush," she said softly. "That's how it gets confused." I backed away until my shoulders brushed the cool brick wall of a building. The footsteps stopped when I did, lingering in the silence like a held breath. When I finally forced myself to look away from the ground and back toward her, she was no longer beside me. The sidewalk where she'd stood was empty. The street stretched on in both directions, unchanged, indifferent. No sign of her, no sign of anyone else. Just the wet pavement and the quiet hum of the lights overhead. I stood there for a long time, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it again. One step. Then another. Slow and deliberate, moving somewhere nearby but never quite close enough to see. I didn't try to follow the sound. I didn't try to run. I walked home carefully, forcing my steps to stay slow and deliberate, afraid of what might happen if I moved too fast. Every few moments, I thought I heard footsteps just behind me, keeping pace, patient and unhurried. Even now, when I walk alone at night, I listen closely to the sound my shoes make on the ground. And sometimes, when I stop suddenly, holding my breath in the quiet, I can still hear her steps continue on without me, fading slowly into the distance like something that doesn't know it's supposed to stop. The sky hung low that night, so low it felt like I could reach up and touch it if I tried, and the weight of it pressed down on the city until everything seemed quieter than it should have been. I noticed it as soon as I stepped outside my apartment building, the air thick and unmoving, the clouds a dull, colorless sheet stretched tight above the rooftops, offering no stars and no sense of distance. It had rained earlier, not heavily, just enough to leave the streets dark and reflective, and the smell of wet concrete clung to everything. The block was familiar, painfully so, the same row of buildings I'd walked past hundreds of times, but something about the way the sky hovered overhead made it feel closed in, like the space had been reduced without anyone telling me. I told myself I was imagining it, that weather could do strange things to perception, and I started walking toward the corner, my hands in my pockets, my shoulders slightly hunched as if that might keep the sky from pressing any closer. My footsteps echoed softly, swallowed almost immediately by the air, and the sound didn't travel the way it usually did. The streetlights were on, but their glow felt weaker, as though the clouds were absorbing the light before it could spread. Shadows pooled along the edges of the sidewalk, darker and more defined than normal, and I caught myself glancing at them too often, half expecting them to move on their own. As I walked, I became aware of how quiet everything was. No distant traffic, no voices from open windows, not even the usual hum of electricity that seemed to live inside the buildings. It felt like the city was holding its breath, and I was the only one still moving through it. I reached the first intersection and slowed, looking up again. The clouds seemed even lower here, the tops of the buildings disappearing into them, their edges blurred and indistinct. The sky didn't feel infinite anymore. It felt close, heavy, and uncomfortably aware. The crosswalk light flickered, its white walking figure glowing for a moment before dimming and brightening again without changing. I stood there longer than necessary, watching it pulse, waiting for it to tell me when to move, but it never did, and the silence around me deepened. When I finally crossed, I felt an odd sense of resistance, like the air itself had thickened. Each step took a little more effort than it should have, and the ground beneath my feet felt subtly uneven, though I could see nothing wrong with the pavement. Halfway down the block, I noticed the pressure in my ears, the same sensation you get before a storm breaks, except the sky showed no sign of releasing anything. It just stayed there, low and unyielding, as if it were testing how much weight the city could bear. I tried to focus on small details to steady myself. A discarded cup near the curb, its sides collapsed inward. A darkened storefront with a faded sign I'd stopped noticing years ago. The pattern of bricks on the building to my left. Familiar things, meant to remind me where I was. Still, something felt off, a quiet wrongness that followed me like a shadow. The block seemed longer than usual, stretching ahead in a way that didn't match my memory. I told myself it was the lighting, the lack of reference points, anything but what my instincts were suggesting. As I walked, the sky seemed to lower further, not visibly, but in a way I felt in my chest, a slow tightening that made it harder to breathe deeply. I found myself walking with my head down, as if avoiding eye contact with something looming just above me. I passed the same tree I always did, its branches bare and slick with rain, but as soon as it was behind me, I had the uneasy thought that I hadn't gone far enough for it to be gone. I kept walking, counting my steps without realizing I was doing it. The street remained empty, unnaturally so. No cars passed, no doors opened, and the buildings seemed sealed shut, their windows dark and reflective, offering no sign of life inside. My reflection stared back at me in warped fragments as I moved, stretched and distorted by the glass. The longer I walked, the more the sky seemed to press down, not just physically but mentally, filling my thoughts with a dull pressure that made it hard to focus. It felt like being underwater, every movement slowed, every sound muted, the world narrowed to a small, oppressive space. I reached the next corner and stopped, surprised by how relieved I felt to see it. The intersection should have been a simple marker, a sign that I was making progress, but when I looked back the way I'd come, the block behind me looked no shorter than the one ahead. I stood there, turning slowly, trying to get my bearings. The sky was uniformly low in every direction, the clouds pressed flat and featureless, giving me no sense of orientation. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that I might not be where I thought I was. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound thin and strange in the still air, and shook my head. "Get a grip," I muttered, though my voice sounded distant, like it didn't quite belong to me. I turned and continued walking, choosing a direction almost at random, trusting muscle memory more than my eyes. The pressure in my chest eased slightly with movement, but it never fully went away, lingering like a warning I didn't understand. As the minutes passed, the block refused to end. The buildings repeated in subtle ways, not identical but close enough to make me doubt myself. A fire escape here, a boarded window there, details rearranged just enough to feel familiar without being reassuring. The sky felt closer now, so close that I imagined I could feel it brushing against the tops of my thoughts. I found myself walking faster, then slowing abruptly, afraid that moving too quickly might draw attention to me, though I had no idea from what. I checked my phone, more for comfort than necessity, but the screen felt too bright in the dim street, and the time meant nothing to me when I saw it. I slipped it back into my pocket. Suddenly uneasy about looking down for too long. A faint sound reached me then, something like distant music, muffled and indistinct. I stopped, listening, my heart beating faster as I tried to place it. The sound seemed to come from somewhere ahead, seeping out from between the buildings. I followed it cautiously, each step measured, the pressure overhead intensifying as if the sky disapproved of my curiosity. The music didn't get louder, but it became clearer, a slow, looping melody that felt out of place in the empty street. I traced it to a building on the corner, one I'd passed countless times without noticing. Its facade was blank, the walls unbroken by windows, the entrance a dark rectangle that absorbed the streetlight instead of reflecting it. The music came from inside. I stood there, staring at the door, my breath shallow, the sky pressing down harder than ever, as if urging me to move on. The melody continued, steady and calm, and for a moment, I felt the strange urge to open the door and step inside, just to see what would happen. I didn't. Instead, I turned away, the unease in my chest spiking as soon as I did. The block stretched out ahead of me again, long and quiet, the sky hanging low and patient, waiting for something I couldn't name. As I walked on, the sense of being watched crept in, subtle but persistent. Not from any one direction, but from above, from the space where the sky hovered too close for comfort. I resisted the urge to look up again, afraid of what I might feel if I did. The street curved slightly, though I could have sworn it was straight, and with that gentle bend came the unsettling realization that I no longer knew exactly how far I'd walked. The landmarks blurred together, my sense of distance eroded by the constant pressure overhead. I slowed, then stopped, listening to the sound of my own breathing. It sounded loud in the quiet street, too loud. And I waited for something else to break the silence, some proof that the city was still there with me. Nothing did. When I finally moved again, it was with the careful determination of someone afraid of making the wrong choice. The sky remained low, the block remained long, and the feeling that I was walking through a place that no longer quite belonged to me settled deeper into my bones. By the time I realized I should have reached the end of the block, I was no longer sure there was an end at all. The buildings continued, the streetlights repeated, and the sky pressed down without mercy, as if the city were being slowly flattened beneath it. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and looked up despite myself. The clouds were so close now that they seemed solid, a ceiling instead of a sky, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I had the overwhelming sense that if I reached up, they would push back. I stood there until my neck ached, until the weight of the sky felt unbearable, and when I finally lowered my gaze, the block looked exactly the same as it had before, unchanged and indifferent. I started walking again, because standing still felt worse, and as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sky wasn't just pressing the city down, but slowly teaching it how to stay that way, leaving me to wonder how much lower it could go before there was nowhere left for me to stand. I checked the time, but my phone had no date, and at first, I thought it was just a glitch. It was a little past midnight, the kind of hour where everything feels muted and stretched, and I had been walking through the streets near my apartment for longer than I could remember. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of rain that had fallen hours ago, and the streetlights cast long pools of yellow light across the wet pavement. I had started my walk to clear my mind, thinking a familiar route would be comforting. But the streets were oddly quiet that night. The usual distant hum of traffic was gone, windows were dark and unyielding, and even the faint whistle of wind seemed absent. It felt as if the city had paused and forgotten me. When I first noticed my phone acting strangely, I didn't pay much attention. The lock screen showed the time correctly, but the dates section was blank, replaced by a simple, featureless gray line. I unlocked it, thinking it would correct itself, but nothing changed. No notification popped up, no reminder, no sign that the device had malfunctioned in any other way. I frowned and glanced around. The street looked the same, lined with the familiar sequence of buildings and trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly off. The buildings seemed closer together, or maybe the light had shifted, I couldn't be sure. My steps felt heavier, and the silence pressed against me like thick fog. I looked at the phone again. Still no date. I tried restarting it quickly, just to reset whatever glitch had happened, but when it powered back on, it was the same. Time was there, flowing normally, or at least it seemed normal, but the date, any hint of day, month, or year, was completely absent. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the software had crashed, or the settings had been altered. I pulled up the calendar app. Nothing. Blank. Empty. Just gray. No months, no days, no numbers. My heart began to thump in my chest, slower than panic, more like the steady beat of dread settling over me. I raised my eyes to the street. The world hadn't changed, or maybe it had, and I just didn't have the reference to notice. Everything looked familiar but somehow wrong. The streetlight ahead flickered once and then stabilized, illuminating the same stretch of road I had passed countless times before. Yet I could feel, deep in my chest, that the distance I'd traveled didn't make sense. I continued walking, phone in hand, staring at the blank date as though it might whisper an answer if I concentrated hard enough. Each step echoed softly against the wet pavement. Somewhere far away, a car passed, then disappeared instantly, leaving the air oppressively still again. I tried to focus on landmarks, a cracked sidewalk, a lamppost with peeling paint, a faded mailbox. Each familiar feature should have grounded me, but instead, they seemed to repeat, subtly rearranged, as if the city were replaying itself. The longer I walked, the more certain I became that I'd already been here. Not just on this street, but in this exact sequence, this exact rhythm of silence and dampness. The phone felt heavier in my hand, and the emptiness of the calendar gnawed at me. It wasn't just missing the date, it was missing context, history. Every day I thought I'd lived, every routine I'd followed, all suspended. I glanced at the clock again. Time ticked forward, merciless and steady, but it felt meaningless. I couldn't anchor it to anything. The street curved slightly. Or maybe it didn't. My brain struggled to reconcile what I saw with what I knew. I passed the same building twice, I thought, but I hadn't turned around. My mind began to question itself in ways it never had before. Somewhere ahead, a faint light glimmered in a window. I walked toward it, hoping for some sign of life, a person, anything tangible. When I reached the building, it was dark inside. The light was gone. I pressed my hand against the door, cold and unyielding. No response. I turned back to the street. The same stretch of road stretched endlessly, the same lampposts repeating in a pattern that refused to resolve. My phone buzzed. A notification, perhaps? But when I unlocked it, the date was still gone, blank as ever. Only the time remained, glowing calmly, dispassionately. I kept walking. My steps echoed in the silence. I tried to remember when this had started, if it had started tonight. Or if I had been walking like this for days. Weeks? Months? The absence of the date made it impossible to tell. The city around me was unchanging, indifferent, pressing down with the same quiet weight as the sky above. I passed a familiar alley, glanced in, and saw nothing but darkness and wet brick walls. A thought flitted across my mind, maybe the date had disappeared because it never existed, because I had never left this street at all. I stopped in the middle of the road and looked down at my phone one last time. The time ticked steadily forward, unhelpful, unrelenting. The date remained an empty gray line, a void where orientation should have been. I walked on anyway, because standing still felt wrong. Every step echoed into the silence, every step taking me somewhere I couldn't name, somewhere I had already been, somewhere I might never leave. The absence of the date followed me, pressing down quietly, heavier than the night, heavier than the city, heavier than myself. She whispered, "Not yet," softly, and the words reached me before I realized she was there. They didn't come from behind me or ahead of me, but from that quiet space just beside my ear, close enough that I felt the faint warmth of breath. I stopped walking immediately, my body reacting faster than my thoughts, and the silence around me seemed to tighten in response. The street looked exactly the same as it had moments before. The same wet pavement, the same dim streetlights, the same low sky pressing down without mercy. There was no sudden movement, no obvious sign of another person. Just the lingering echo of her voice, gentle and calm, like a reminder rather than a warning. I stood still, my heart beating slowly but heavily, each pulse sending a dull throb through my chest. I didn't want to turn around. Something about the way she'd spoken made me certain that if I did, I wouldn't see anything new. Or worse, I would see something I wasn't meant to notice yet. "Not yet," she had said, as if responding to a question I hadn't asked out loud. I swallowed and took a shallow breath, the air feeling thick and stale in my lungs. "Not yet for what?" I asked quietly, my voice sounding too loud in the empty street. There was no answer. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. The mind can do strange things when it's tired, when it's surrounded by silence and repetition. I tried to convince myself it had been a fragment of memory, a thought that had slipped free and sounded external. Then I felt it again. That subtle sense of presence, like someone standing just out of view, occupying the same space without disturbing it. The feeling didn't scare me the way I thought it should have. Instead, it settled over me with a strange familiarity, like this wasn't the first time it had happened. I took one cautious step forward. My foot made contact with the pavement, and the sound echoed faintly before being swallowed by the air. I waited for something to stop me. Nothing did. I walked on, slower now, every muscle tense, my awareness stretched thin. I kept listening for her footsteps, for any sound that didn't belong to me, but the street remained quiet. Too quiet. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the night were absorbing it. The block felt longer than before. I knew it shouldn't have been, but the distance ahead of me refused to shrink. Each streetlight I passed revealed another just like it further on, their glow overlapping in a monotonous pattern that made it impossible to tell how far I'd gone. I thought about turning back, but the idea made my chest tighten. I had the unsettling sense that going backward wouldn't change anything, that the street would simply rearrange itself around me, offering the same view in reverse. As I walked, I became aware of a faint sound beneath my footsteps. Not another set of steps, not exactly, but something softer. almost like the brush of fabric or the whisper of movement just out of sync with me. It was subtle enough that I couldn't be sure it was real, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop listening. "That's not what you're waiting for," she whispered again, her voice barely disturbing the air. This time, I turned. She stood beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. I hadn't seen her approach. She was simply there, as if the space had always been meant for her. Her expression was calm, her eyes focused ahead rather than on me, and her posture was relaxed, like this was an ordinary walk on an ordinary night. "How long have you been here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what I meant by here. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to suggest reassurance. "Longer than you think," she said. The way she said it made my stomach twist. I glanced around, half expecting the street to react to her presence, but nothing changed. The buildings remained still, the lights steady, the sky low and heavy. I noticed then that her footsteps didn't make any sound. I tried not to stare at her feet, but the absence of noise felt louder than any echo. My own steps sounded too sharp by comparison, each one reminding me that I was still connected to the ground in a way she wasn't. "Am I supposed to be going somewhere?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Eventually," she said. "But not yet." There it was again. The same phrase, spoken with gentle certainty. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a rule. We walked together for a while after that. I didn't remember deciding to move, only that we were suddenly in motion, side by side, the street stretching endlessly ahead. I tried to focus on her presence, on the reality of another person beside me, but the longer I looked, the more indistinct she seemed at the edges, like a reflection that hadn't fully resolved. "Why does it feel like I've been here before?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. The silence between us grew heavy, filled with the soft hum of the streetlights and the distant, almost imagined sound of something moving far away. "Because you have," she said finally. "You just don't remember leaving." The words settled into me slowly, each one sinking deeper than the last. I searched my memory for a clear beginning, a moment when the walk had started, but all I found were fragments. Stepping out into the night. The low sky. The endless block. No clear start, no clear destination. I stopped walking again. This time, she continued on for a few steps before stopping herself. She turned to face me, her expression unchanged, patient. "I want to go home," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "That's natural." "But?" I asked. "But you're not finished yet." The street seemed to narrow then, the buildings leaning in just enough to make the space feel constrained. I felt a familiar pressure in my chest, the same one I'd felt earlier, as if the city itself were listening. "What happens when I'm finished?" I asked. She smiled gently. "You'll know." She took a step backward, then another, creating a small distance between us. The space she left behind felt colder, emptier, like something essential had been removed. "Wait," I said, reaching out without thinking. She paused, her form already beginning to blur slightly, like she was stepping into a different focus. "Not yet," she whispered one last time. Then she was gone. The street returned to its quiet stillness, unchanged and indifferent. I stood there alone, my hands still half raised, listening to the faint echo of her voice fade into the night. I looked down at my phone. The time had advanced, steady and meaningless. The date was still gone. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and started walking again, because the block stretched on ahead of me, patient and unending. Or if I had been walking like this for days. Weeks? Months? The absence of the date made it impossible to tell. The city around me was unchanging, indifferent, pressing down with the same quiet weight as the sky above. I passed a familiar alley, glanced in, and saw nothing but darkness and wet brick walls. A thought flitted across my mind: maybe the date had disappeared because it never existed, because I had never left this street at all. I stopped in the middle of the road and looked down at my phone one last time. The time ticked steadily forward, unhelpful, unrelenting. The date remained an empty gray line, a void where orientation should have been. I walked on anyway, because standing still felt wrong. Every step echoed into the silence, every step taking me somewhere I couldn't name, somewhere I had already been, somewhere I might never leave. The absence of the date followed me, pressing down quietly, heavier than the night, heavier than the city, heavier than myself. And somewhere in the silence, I had the unsettling feeling that she was still walking too, just a few steps ahead, waiting for the moment when "not yet" would finally change. The street kept me, and it didn't explain why, and that was the worst part of it. There was no moment where I felt grabbed or trapped. No sudden panic, no clear decision taken away from me. I was simply there, still walking, still breathing, still moving forward while everything else quietly stopped making sense. It was sometime after midnight, though I only knew that because the sky was that deep, heavy shade of gray-black that only comes when night has settled fully and has no intention of leaving soon. The clouds hung low again, pressing down on the buildings, flattening the sounds of the city until even my footsteps felt muted, like they didn't want to travel too far. I tried to leave the block. That thought felt important, like something I should hold on to. I remember reaching the corner, seeing the intersection ahead.